If that works for you, Torn.
Yeah. Well, all right, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. This is our third installment of our social justice series. I have had the pleasure of working with Ahmed and Elizabeth, our two wonderful equity coaches. They will be facilitating and co-facilitating today's webinar. So without further ado, please take it away, guys.
Awesome, thank you. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Ahmed Abjarade, they, them pronouns. I'm normally out in Waterbury, but as some of you heard earlier in this call, before we kind of got started, I'm actually out in California right now for a family medical emergency, but really glad that I'm able to kind of be here with you all today. And then my co-facilitator is Elizabeth McGee, she, her pronouns. So we're both really excited to be here with you all. So we're going to get started with just some basic introductions. So your name, pronouns, your location, and then really wanted to kind of ask you all a question of what inspires you to do sustainability work. And so we'll give you a few moments to kind of think that over. Feel free to jump right into the chat and introduce yourself, or feel free to unmute yourself and share with the group that introduction.
I'll go. I
Yep,
can
go
go.
ahead.
Yeah. My name is Janice Snyder. There's many pronouns that go by. This one will be she. I'm from South Windsor. Serve on the town council, and I was on the Board of Ed, the South Windsor Board of Ed as chair and as a member for 14 years. And now I've been on the town council. I've been deputy mayor and currently a town councilor, and this has been 7 years that I've been doing this. So the town just started up a Black Lives Matter committee, which we're trying to put together the committee, but it's really a social justice type of a committee, and I think it's going to evolve to that. Some of us there's 4 counselors on it, along with 8 other members from the community, just members from the community. And there's a lot of the Black Lives Matter social justice issues going on here in town. And we want to be sure that we address them all. So I signed up for a variety of different classes here because I want to get that knowledge on how to effectively deal with that. And we have other groups in town as well that are concerned about the social injustice. Not so much here in town, but it's starting to resonate here. So I want to be ahead of the curve. I want to understand what our residents need. So when we bring it forth, we can clearly explain it and listen. See, we have to listen. Leaders have to listen to what our residents and our constituents want. So that's what I'm starting to sign up for many of these. And what inspires me to do sustainability work is our town, it's a small town, there's 26,000 people that live in town, and we're similar to Glastonbury and Avon and Farmington and Simsbury, just in our area, in the Hartford area. And we do a lot of things. We have a great staff with a lot of great ideas over the past 5 or 6 years. So when Sustainable CT came out, we jumped right on it because we want to be able to provide a wide variety of, we want to have strength, and our government needs to have strength to support all of its residents. And there's so many reaching arms and tentacles, sometimes I refer to get involved in different areas of the community. So in order to be able to be sustainable, to be able to live on our own, to be able to sustain our own survival without having to, we need to worry about climate, and there's all sorts of things we need to worry about. And by joining Sustainable CT, by the collaboration with other towns and municipalities, we're all learning so much. And as a government leader, that knowledge is just power. So that's why, anything we can do in this town, we have a great staff that wholeheartedly supports it. We've got the Silver Award as well. So we've been working hard, and as soon as they come out with a Gold Award, we'll be working towards that. So I like the collaboration with other towns to learn what we can do better. And we can always do better no matter how good we are. So sorry it took so long, but I
Thank
had a
you.
lot of thoughts to share. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, let me go through the chat and read some of the introductions. So Renee Reese from Hartford, she, her, inspired by need to build community. Awesome, welcome. Mike Rosen, Tolland town manager, he, him, his. Awesome, welcome Mike. Susan Bransfield, she, her. Portland, first select woman. Inspired to improve our community for today, tomorrow, and into the future. Also, Elizabeth McGee is a coach of our town, and her information is educational and very helpful to us. Thank you. Yeah, Elizabeth is wonderful. Tiffany Cunningham, she, her, Salem, Connecticut, interested in climate issues, thriving communities, and inclusion. Welcome. Tammy, I'm just going to go with Tammy. Town Council Chair, Tolland, Connecticut, she, her. Awesome, welcome. Apologies that I don't want to butcher your last name. And Sandra, First Selectman Bolton, she, her. Awesome, well, welcome everyone. Really excited to have you all here with us. So the reason that we kind of asked that last question in there of what inspires you to do sustainability work, and really want you to kind of think about that throughout the session and just moving forward. I know from my own personal experience, oftentimes, we're kind of thrown into things, and it's kind of like the reasons why we do certain things happens later, because it just go, 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 right? We're just from one thing to the other, and we kind of miss out on certain connections around it. And as we were kind of imagining what this session would be like and really trying to link queer and trans and gender justices and really kind of building off of really having a conversation around that, we really wanted to kind of make sure that we were kind of really building off of the things that already inspire you, right? The connections that you've already made, and really making sure that this conversation is as centralized to sustainability as possible. That way, it becomes much easier for you to kind of just take hold of it and immediately begin implementing certain things within your own communities and within your own work if you haven't already. And if you already have, right, then kind of just having some additional general awareness so that you can kind of claim that work and those different connections that you already have. Can we go to the next slide? All right, so as you all hopefully already know, and if not, that's okay. So this is the third session out of a series of 4 sessions. Each are standalones, and they also work really, really well together as well. So if this is your first session, feel free to go back and take a look at session 1 and 2. And if you've been here with us, I do see a couple of names that have been here with us the entire time. Hopefully this is continuously building off of those different sessions. And so next week will kind of be our final session, really centering about building our future communities with transformative justice and what that is and what that looks like and all of those different things. So that's same time, same place next Friday. And I do want to also highlight again that with any of these different conversations, if you're interested in kind of digging deeper in facilitating some of these discussions and conversations within your own towns and your own spaces so that it's highly customized for you specifically wherever you are, that's what equity coaches are for, right? We're here to support a lot of that. And so feel free to reach out to the Sustainable CT staff and they will pair you up with somebody and we can kind of move forward with a lot of these conversations. Next slide. All right, so before we jump into any of the actual material, just wanted to kind of cover a few ground rules that we've kind of been going off of over the last few sessions, right? Really considering that a lot of the topics that we're discussing aren't theoretical topics. These aren't things that impact communities elsewhere. These are things that impact people even on this call and within our spaces virtually everywhere. Right, so really being mindful of that and being mindful of where everyone's kind of coming from. So approaching the topics today from a place of curiosity as opposed to defensiveness. We know that this is a difficult conversation to have. just because of how things are structured. A lot of conversations are really difficult to have these days. And so really want to honor that, honor your need, honor your needs, right? Really want everybody to honor themselves and everybody here. So if you need to kind of take a break, that's perfectly fine, right? This is all recorded. If you wanted to go off video, right, or go on mute or any of those different things, do what you got to do. We really want to make sure that this is beneficial to everybody here. Communicate your needs throughout, right? Thank you, Janice, for that question, right, of who's actually involved with any of this, right? So feel free to reach out to myself, Elizabeth, or Torn under the Sustainable CT staff. And so feel free to let us know if you need anything. Balance sharing and listening, right? So making sure that we're all kind of coming together with all of this, and then ask questions. So one of the things I always say, and this is probably getting annoying for those of you whose this is their third session of ask questions, even if you know that you're the only person in the room that has that question, right? We're here for all of you as individuals, as well as for everybody here as a community. So feel free to ask as many questions as you would like. Feel free to ask in the chat, or at any point, feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions. Just really please be mindful of, we have like 47 more minutes for all of this. And so if there are questions that you have that are semi-related, but not necessarily on the topic itself, feel free to just write those down and reach out to us separately afterwards. We're always willing to kind of correspond separately and answer questions over email. Or again, if you're working for a town and you're thinking of having an equity coach kind of support, those are some of the things that they can dive deeper into a little bit more. Next slide. All right, so just kind of a little bit of the things that we'll kind of cover, and we'll take the conversation in a few different directions today. So with queer and trans justice, really going into the sustainability component, and then really breaking it down a little bit more in terms of what is the LGBPQ and TGNC communities, right? Where are folks, right? Why are those separated for us? Kind of a little bit more about that. And then going into the normalization of human experiences. Because really that's what we're talking about, right? And what we've kind of been talking about over the last few weeks. And one of the things that you'll probably notice if you watch all the recordings or you've been with us all three sessions, is that ultimately when it comes to justice work, it's all the same, right? The foundations don't really shift. The ways to move forward don't really shift. It's really just a matter of how do we expand our vision of what justice is and looks like, and how do we make sure it includes everybody, right? Specifically the most marginalized voices, and what is the most equitable ways to do that. So Torn, next slide. And before I jump into this question, so Catherine introduced herself in the chat. So Catherine, West Hartford energy specialist. What inspires her is to make her community a better place to live, make connections, increase collaboration between people within different municipal departments, community, and other towns. Awesome. Thank you for being here, Catherine. So again, really thinking of that question of why does queerness and transness matter within sustainability work? And as hopefully you've already kind of been thinking about that a little bit prior to joining the session. So feel free to just jump into the chat, add some thoughts. Feel free to even do like one-word answers. But why do you think it matters, right? Like, why do you think we're doing this session? And how do you think it's going to actually relate to the work that you do? So feel free to just jump into the chat, just again, one-word answers or like a sentence or whatever you feel is within you right now. So Catherine says diversity acceptance. Awesome. What else? Michael says cohesiveness of the community. Tiffany says thriving communities include all. Sandra says sense of belonging and equality. Awesome.
I think Janice was gonna speak. I saw her unmute.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead, Jen.
Sure. Same thing as somebody just said was, inclusion, being able to include everybody. I don't want anybody to feel, when you live in a community, I don't want anybody to feel like an outsider. We need to welcome everybody. And what do we have to do to provide the services that everybody needs, especially to special groups? Thanks.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, so all of these are really incredible answers. And Susan says, have everyone as part of our community. Yeah, absolutely, right? And it's really beautiful to hear that all of you are kind of interested in making sure that your communities are spaces of belonging for everyone, right? Where there is that safety, where there is that cohesiveness of the community, where there's spaces where everyone can kind of be and exist and thrive. And that's always really, really beautiful to hear. And which is really great and really wonderful and really, really critical to this conversation. And also at the same time, like one of the things that we want to make sure that we capture within this session is that one of the reasons that it does matter, whether it's this conversation, whether it's last week's conversation, whether it was the week before that, is that it's, when it comes to sustainability work, there are very specific populations that are more fragile in the face of environmental catastrophe, right, than others. So Tori, if we go to the next slide. Right, so many of the challenges that you're all addressing in your day-to-day work, right, around sustainability are actually, a lot of those problems are heavily impacting queer and trans folks, right, and that goes across the state. And so one of the things that we've like I've seen personally from my work with my full-time job is just how little support there is for different marginalized groups across the state, right? And how invisible they are along the way, right? I've spoken with certain towns and cities, and we'll have conversations about like the needs of the trans community. And I've had some council people be like, well, we don't have trans people in this community. And for some of those communities, I actually know them really well, or folks are reaching out to us for some mutual aid support and things like that. And it's like, well, actually, there's like 4 that work in the city, right? And so it's not that queer and trans folks are completely separated from all of our spaces, right? We're kind of everywhere. And really want to make sure that we capture that because oftentimes, queer and trans folks, similar to disabled folks, similar to BIPOC individuals, kind of become invisible in broader spaces, whether that's in urban cities or in the smallest rural towns. There's always work that we could do to really capture how how individuals are being impacted, and how we make sure that we capture people's voices so that we address those impacts. So Tori, next slide.
And one thing I would just add to that is, to Achmed's point, is if they are in the community and you just might not be aware of it, alternatively, they might not be coming to your community because they don't perceive it as a welcoming or safe space. So it can kind of be 2 things, where they're there and you're just not aware, or they're not coming because they're not feeling welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, and so kind of with that, so what we're really talking about, and these are a lot of the things that you would already be working on, right, within your sustainable CT actions, right, what you're all hopefully working on already within your communities. But queer and trans folks are going to be heavily impacted when it comes to things like housing, like healthcare, like economic opportunities, and even safety, right? And so the safety piece is one of the reasons that I found it was really refreshing that a lot of you kind of centered that, right, of wanting people to thrive within the community, right, wanting that belonging and the equality and equity that should exist within every single space, because we don't live in a very safe world, right? We don't live in very safe spaces. And one of the things that we want to really challenge all of you with over with this conversation, next week's conversation, with the previous 2 conversations that we've had, right, is really thinking of all of these conversations as within the same bucket, right, of oftentimes what ends up happening is we'll separate the LGBTQ and TGNC communities from BIPOC communities, from disabled communities. Right, currently with the work that I do with my full-time job, right, and Life in My Days team is doing a lot of mutual aid work kind of across the state within 75 different municipalities. A lot of the people that we are supporting are Black, undocumented, trans, and disabled, right? All of those identities together. And so really thinking of how those different intersects also impact individuals versus just, well, the LGBTQ community is safe here, but really thinking of, well, are disabled LGBTQ individuals safe? Are Black disabled LGBTQ members safe, right? And so on and so forth, and really just expanding continuously, right, that horizon of what safety looks like for different individuals. And to Elizabeth's point, right, of really making sure that, because I wholeheartedly believe of, if we build safety, people will come, right? Of that, it's people are drawn to belonging. People are drawn to that sense of safety. And unfortunately, again, there's so little of it out there that it does send an enormous message. And so again, like we've been talking about, right, with this session, with the previous two sessions, when it comes to any marginalized community, they're particularly vulnerable in the face of climate catastrophe, right? And so, like, one of the things that going into the pandemic a little bit, right, there are certain circles of mine that, you know, I'll have a conversation with a person and they'll be like, you know, I don't know a single person who's gotten COVID, right? Not a single person who's tested positive, not a single person who has died, right? And then I go to other communities, right, or other circles, and there's nobody who doesn't know somebody who's affected, right? Who doesn't know somebody who's lost somebody, right? And so really looking at that divide, right? Like what makes those differences? And to me, it's the same conversation about sustainability, because how many of us in our personal lives know people who have experienced houselessness, right? Who have absolutely no access to healthcare or any type of health insurance or different types of just medical services and things like that. How many of us know people who will be fired from every single job they ever have, right, due to different identities, right? And so really thinking of those things and beginning to kind of expand all of that, of how do we start looking at sustainability with all of that in mind, versus just what we're seeing right in front of us, right? So many of these problems, unfortunately, are invisible unless you know what you're looking for, right? Or somebody actually tells you about them and is like, hey, look right over here, right? Because of how systems actually work. And we know this from a lot of our sustainability work, right? That it's not just a matter of we decided to do something and so all of a sudden everything has already fit into place, right? There's different systemic things, there's different barriers that exist. So really keeping all of those in mind. So Torin, next slide. All right, so with that said, we'll kind of take a step back, right? And actually go into, like, what does LGBTQ and TGNC stand for, right? Like, where are these communities and why are they separated? Before we go into that, and Elizabeth, if you want to kind of talk a little bit about the LGBTQ part of it, that would be really wonderful. But before we go into that, one of the reasons that this isn't a typical training, right, of like, let's start with LGBTQ or let's start with LGBTQ and then break it down from there. Let's actually talk about, like, what does it mean to be lesbian? What does it mean to be gay, right? Like, what is bi? All of those different things, and really breaking it down from there. Is really for a couple of reasons. One, there's a lot of those trainings out there, and if folks are interested in training like that, we're happy to do one. And two, because you're already doing this work, really wanted to make sure that this is as direct as possible to the work that you're doing, and also that we're coming from a place of that we're not here to justify or prove to anybody that the LGBTQ and TGNC communities exist, that certain circumstances impact them more than others and things like that. Right, we're not here to kind of debate certain identities and things like that, right? Like I said, we have individuals here I myself am part of both of those communities, the LGBTQ and TGNC communities, right? So we're kind of talking from lived experience and really wanted to kind of honor that and really humanize the conversation in that this has been a reality, this will always be a reality. Then let's just talk about how this actually impacts our work. So Elizabeth, would you mind talking a little bit about the LGBTQ?
Sure. Is there anything specifically you'd like me to touch on?
Just what it is.
Oh, okay.
Just like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So what the acronym stands for is lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, and queer. You've probably heard this acronym, you know, sometimes it's referred to LGBTQ plus, LGBTQ. It has evolved in the community and it's still evolving and ever evolving. And I think one of the really important things to note about that is that don't be, you know, I go into certain communities and they're like, I'm afraid to even run a session on this or talk about this in my community because I might get a label wrong or I might mess up and that'll completely, you know, rub the community the wrong way and I'll get it all wrong and the relationship will end. I think it's all about intentions and going in with the right intentions when you're having these conversations and asking the community the labels that they're currently using and what labels resonate most with them. I think there's great openness within the community to talk with folks outside the LGBTQ community about what labels work for them. Another thing just around the Q that's maybe important to talk about. So historically, the Q has actually, if you talk to elder or folks that are a bit older, the Q is that queer was actually a term that was quite derogatory. So older LGBTQ populations might actually not prefer the term queer, whereas younger populations have actually really embraced the term queer, and it's often commonly used. So just being aware of that history is really important. I guess one other thing to mention is sometimes the queer is used as an umbrella term, like a catch-all. So the queer can be meant to represent the whole umbrella of LGBTQ. Queer is also sometimes used for pansexual people. It's kind of synonymous with pansexual. So sometimes it's used in a very specific way. Sometimes it's used in an umbrella term. So if you're interacting with the community and that label is being thrown out, just to make sure that you're clarifying which way it's being used and also clarifying if there is both younger and older LGBTQ populations in the room, making sure that they're comfortable with the use of queer if it is being used as a catch-all term. Those are some things that come to mind. I don't know if that's hitting on what you had in mind.
That was like everything. Thank you. That's perfect. Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind with like everything that we talk about, whether in this session or again any of the other sessions, right, is always have the folks with lived experience, right, identify themselves for themselves. Right, I've been to a lot of places, right, where you know, queer is not acceptable, right, and also at the same time, right, as a person who identifies as queer, right, I'm not going to go and modify how I identify, right, and usually like. And I've been in certain spaces where, you know, an older gay person, right, who has been harmed by the word queer, right, will be like, oh, like that's not okay to use, and I'll be like, no, like we're reclaiming it, and like he'll be like, yeah, okay, cool, we're good, right, like, and it's that simple, right? We just move forward and almost instantaneously. So really keep that in mind. Of it's okay if people don't want to identify one way or another. Whatever people identify as, that's really up to them. And so going to the TGNC side, so that stands for Trans and Gender Nonconforming, which is also, again, a lot of you have probably heard of transness is kind of just included within the LGBTQ plus community, right? In a lot of spaces, we'll kind of mix the two communities together. For this space, we kind of wanted to separate the two for a few different reasons. What do you think some of those reasons are? That we felt it was important for us to kind of have separate conversations about these two different communities. or why are they different? And feel free to jump into the chat and type out some words again. Again, it could be just like one word, or it could be like a sentence or something like that. So Janice has different needs, absolutely. And we'll go into that in just a little bit as well. What else? Elizabeth says one sexual identity, one gender identity. Absolutely, right? So they're completely separate in that regard. And oftentimes there's this kind of misconception, right, that if you're trans, you're automatically part of the LGBTQ community. And those are very different types of identities, right? One is a gender identity, one's a sexual identity. Tammy says one is sexual preference, one is gender. Absolutely. Tiffany says it's important for the leadership of a community is aware that people identify in many different ways. Absolutely, right? And even with these letters, right? So we have 9 letters here. Those barely skim the surface of the reality of what's possible out there, right? And what people identify as, and the complexity of it all, right? So like I mentioned, I personally identify with both those communities, right? And that experience is going to be different than somebody who only identifies with one of those communities on either side, right? And again, there's additional letters, additional types of identities and things like that. And so it does get much more complex. And again, really the most important piece is recognizing that they are different, the needs are going to be different, and also that people identify in whatever ways that they decide to, right? Versus us being like, here are the only 3 ways that you're able to identify. So really keeping that in mind. So Torrin, if we go to the next slide. So wanted to just highlight a few key statistical differences between the communities in terms of how certain things impact TGNC communities versus LGBTQ. And I guess just before that slightly, for folks who aren't familiar with even just like the term trans or what it actually refers to. So when it comes to gender identity, right, there's individuals who identify with the gender that they were given at birth, and there are individuals who do not. And it's really just that simple, right? It could be that you identify with no gender at all. It could be that you identify with multiple genders. It could be that you identify as non-binary, right? As kind of beyond these 2 genders. It could be that you identify as another binary gender, but different than the one that you were assigned at birth. It could be a lot of different things. And so when we refer to trans and gender nonconforming, we're really describing all of that. So any person who does not identify with the gender that they were identified with at birth would automatically be part of the TGNC community. Now there's a lot of complexity around that. There are people who won't identify within that community, and that's wonderful. There are people who will, also wonderful. There are people who will identify with various elements of it, also wonderful. The beauty of like the human experience is it's just wonderful, and how expansive it can be. So just a few different statistics. So trans women of color have a life expectancy of 30 to 35 years of age. And that varies slightly depending on where you are. And that's compared to cisgender people have a life expectancy of around 78. So that's potentially close to 48-year difference in life expectancy, specifically of trans women of color versus cisgender individuals. When it comes to suicide rates, right, they're much higher for the LGBTQ community, and then they're even higher for the TGNC community. So LGBTQ communities are, specifically youth and adults, are about 2 to 4 times more likely to attempt or die from suicide as their heterosexual counterparts. In trans individuals, there are some studies that show that up to 70% of trans individuals have attempted suicide at one point in their lives. The lower end of those statistics are 40%. So 40% is like the best case scenario there is. So really thinking of that, right, of how that's going to impact different people. When it comes to trans individuals, at least 30% have experienced employment discrimination. And we could imagine why. And this has been going on for a really long time. And as a lot of you probably know, when it comes to employment discrimination, it's really difficult to, to prove that and things like that in a court of law. So the vast majority will never actually be able to hold their employers accountable. And then last but not least, and I wanted to kind of highlight this one a little bit because I was kind of surprised by this statistic as I was kind of looking into different statistics, but 17% of trans youth will leave school due to bullying and harassment, which means that at some point when kids are 15, 16, 17, they will leave school entirely. That's close to like 1 in 5 kids leaving school specifically because of the bullying that happens with that. And when we look deeper into bullying and things like that, unfortunately, bullying is so prevalent at this point that folks are being bullied for virtually almost every identity out there. And unfortunately, when we dig deeper into who's doing the bullying in particular, it becomes kind of evenly split between 50% is happening from other students and peers, and 50% of bullying is actually occurring from teachers and administrators within the school system itself. So in my line of work, I've worked with certain school systems for some of these things, right, where it was specifically teachers or administrators who severely bullied some of their students, whether within their own classrooms or just students that are within the school. And yeah, it's pretty awful. And so going back to some of the things that we were talking about when it comes to the sustainability elements of this, right? So when it comes to experiencing homelessness, in terms of suicide, in terms of psychological distress and things like that, right? You can see the enormous differences within communities. And this in particular looks at the differences between individuals who don't have community versus ones who do, right? The ones who have support versus the ones who don't. And there's a lot of statistics that actually show that specifically LGBTQ and TGNC youth, if they have a single person who's supportive, right, who's gender affirming, who is fully supportive of all their identities and things like that, their likelihood of dying from suicide decreases by 70% at least. There are some studies that show it's higher than that, right? But that's just one person, right? So thinking of all of your communities, right? And what you're able to kind of impact within your towns and your cities. Imagine if everybody had that one person, and not only that one person, but your entire community actually was there for you, or even like 5% of the community, 10%, 20%, right? It just gets better from there. So Torrin, next slide. All right, so I know we've talked a lot about sustainability at this point and kind of like the links between various identities. And again, over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about disability, we've talked about race, kind of how everything kind of works together. And the conversation's still more or less the same. And especially when it comes to sustainability, right, where a lot of sustainability, right, is the impact of things that we've done, right, to this land, to the earth around us, right, the harm and the damage that we've collectively done. There's an enormous link between how we regulate the environment and the land around us and how we regulate and colonize different bodies, right? And so if you think of autonomy, right, and who actually owns their own bodies, right, and has full authority to make any decisions, right, one of the main reasons that the LGBTQ communities and the TGNC communities are highly stigmatized, right, is it's a matter of autonomy, right? It's a matter of who owns whose bodies, right? And so we'll have a lot of conversations about like, can children be trans, right? There's conversations about, well, what are the regulations that have to go into a person going through certain types of reconstructive surgery, right? Or to even be able to identify as trans in a legal framework, right? And for those of you that are not as familiar with that piece of it, usually that requires about 2 years of therapy, at least a year of the individual living with the gender marker that of their choice, right? But they have to live that way publicly. For any name change, they have to publicly in a public newspaper make that announcement of, I'm changing my name from X to Y, and it's years of it, right? And even after all of that, most insurance companies will not cover any of those surgeries, or not cover most of it, right? And so it's a very long process. It's a very regulated process, and the question arises of who owns their own bodies, right? Who has that full autonomy? And if we think of other identities as well, right? And Jordan, if we can go to the next slide, unfortunately, that's the case for the vast majority of marginalized individuals, right? If we think about women, right? And the autonomy that women have in terms of their own bodies, right? And what that looks like, there's a lot of different regulations and laws out there that govern certain ways, right, that that women get to own their bodies. It's the same with non-binary and trans people. It's the same with Black, Indigenous, Brown people. It's the same with disabled people. It's the same with immigrants and refugees. It's the same with all types of queer bodies, as they're regulated in different ways, right? And so if we think about all of these different identities, right, and them operating in a way that makes the most sense to all of them in different ways, a lot of that has been fought over extended periods of time, and it's led to a lot of different challenges. And I know I shared this book last week, but wanted to kind of share it again because I think it's a book that really captures a lot of what we're talking about in terms of autonomy, right, and who owns their own bodies, in just this one book. And this book is about 25 years old right now, and yet the conversation has not changed, right? The foundation of reproductive rights, of how that's linked to race, how that's linked to queerness and transness and ability and immigration, all of those different things, that conversation is very much still the same. And so would highly encourage folks to read the book if they have time and are inspired to. So Torrin, if we go to the next slide.
Can I just mention something
Yeah, go ahead.
on that? Yeah, so one of the things that comes to mind when I think of what Ahmed was just talking about is, it can seem a little bit abstract, but if you think of even the history of something like disability rights, so for someone that, and I'm thinking of something very overt, so someone that's like in a wheelchair, so like at a glance you can see, okay, this person has a mobility constraint. And so if you look at the history of disability rights, it was like, well, of course communities want to create public spaces that are accessible for those folks and safe for those folks to access. So that's something that I think when people think about safety and they think about access and they think about bodies, it's really tangible and people get it. They're like, of course, if someone's in a wheelchair, we want to create the infrastructure in public buildings to make those folks feel safe and so that they can readily access those services. The same holds true with all of those other populations, although what is making it unsafe or making it hard for folks to access may be more invisible. So it's not going to be, oh, I look at that person and I see a wheelchair. It's not going to be that identifiable. So I think it's really, really critical that we're having conversations with these populations and talking about what makes them feel unsafe in accessing public space and public buildings and public services, and or even just being and living in the community, and what makes it hard for them to access. So that's something I find when I talk to communities, they get the disability, and more specifically, they get disability when it's very overt, like I said, in a wheelchair, but all these other things, it's harder to wrap your head around because it's more invisible, but that's where you really need to tap into the community to help kind of break it down.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And and kind of going off of that, of also like considering that, you know, even when it comes to those really obvious things, right? Like today, like everyone is like, yes, an elevator should be there, right? There should be a ramp, there should be all of these things. And oftentimes we kind of, we rarely talk about like, well, how did we get to that point, right? What did it take for the ADA to be passed in the first place, right? And the type of work, the immense like backlash that happened, and that goes for all of these communities, right? There has never been a single community, right, that's marginalized that has asked for rights where those rights were immediately honored, and it was like, all right, we're good. Yes, that makes perfect sense. Like, you want things this way, it impacts you, wonderful, like let's go and do that immediately because we're going to honor that. And it's always been a fight, it's always been a struggle, to the point of there have been times where it's required like full-on revolutions and entire movements. Right, we're at the 100th anniversary of the suffragette movement, right? And women being able to vote for the first time. And when you look at the history of that, right, of something that seems today, 100 years later, as so simple, right, of like, why would women not vote, right? But looking at the amount of harm and damage that, and the backlash that women received back then, right, and still receive to this day in certain areas, right, it's never been an easy process, right? And so I wanted to kind of mention that because as you go into your own spaces, into your own communities, and you have these conversations and you're straying from the way it's always been, right, or some sort of mainstream vision of this, there could be backlash, right? There could be pieces of it where it's not going to be easy to digest. It's not going to go and be like, well, yeah, obviously that makes perfect sense. Like trans people deserve safety and housing and economic opportunities and all of these different things. And unfortunately, oftentimes it's the exact opposite. It's a complete like full on force, right? Of like, nope, we're not accepting that. And we see that with a lot of things, right? We see that when it comes to reproductive rights, we see it with Black lives, we see it with disability, we see it with trans rights, and queer rights. And I don't know how many of you are kind of familiar with everything going on within the trans community right now in terms of legal pieces. But there's a lot of different things just across the country that literally every couple of weeks a new law gets passed, right, that restricts trans individuals' lives a little bit more, right, and then a little bit more, and there's a lot of it, right, and so it's so it shows up in a lot of different ways in a lot of different spaces, and really always keep that in mind of that every single right that any of us who are marginalized have is because people fought for it. Right, and so thinking of within your own communities, right, and this is probably one of the biggest things that anybody can do within their own community, right, really looking at, well, within our community, what is already acceptable or would be easy to digest and what would be completely unacceptable. And every community is going to have certain things, right, whatever they are, right, like, and not saying this out of shame, not saying this out of like, oh, all of you need to do better today kind of thing, but just a reality, right, of the way our communities have been built historically of there are things that are acceptable, there are things that are not. And really thinking of, well, what are the things that would need to happen in the foundation of our communities themselves so that everybody can be accepted regardless of identities, whether we know of these identities or not. Certain identities are shifting, are going to shift over time. Right, and so it's not just about, well, we made space for gay individuals or queer individuals or trans individuals. It's we made space for individuals. It's we've made space and built a community that's equitable and safe for everybody. And that's really where we would want to kind of go. So just to kind of give you a few, I guess, additional examples of like, what does all of this actually look like on the ground? Right, so if you think of a lot of zoning policies, in Connecticut, zoning policies are really interesting to get into of how varied and how diverse they are, and also how harmful they could be to certain individuals. right? I often get asked a lot of times of like, well, why don't people move to certain areas and all that kind of stuff? And oftentimes you have to go into the zoning policies, right, into the actual histories of certain spaces, and really kind of consider a lot of those things. There's also the concept of gerrymandering. I don't know if all of you are already familiar with it, but that's basically dividing up different spaces when it comes to either local or state or federal elections, right? But splitting things up in a way where we're more or less always receiving the same results, right? That always go with the status quo versus going against it. We have things like the pink tax. How many of you are familiar with the pink tax? Just like a raise of hands. So, okay, awesome. I always love it when, I always love it when people are familiar with it and also when people are not familiar with it. So there's no wrong answer for that one. So the pink tax has been around for quite a while. And basically any product that is pink or any product that's made for women versus males is taxed more heavily than their male counterparts. So for example, you could go and get the exact same razor, but one is blue, one is pink. The pink one is going to cost more. When you're thinking of any like menstrual products or anything at all that has been deemed as more feminine, right, or more for females, there's an additional tax to it that male products do not have, and that more or less is a global tax in various areas, and so companies are taxed differently for selling mostly pink products, which is why they end up more expensive. So next time you're in the grocery store, take a look at like that exact same like razor, the pink one versus like the blue one, and see the price difference. In some places they have started eliminating the pink tax, but it's still fairly prevalent and very few people know about it. And so it's gone also invisible, but it exists in the vast majority of places. Which brings us to the unequitable decision-making. So this picture in the background, and this isn't the only picture of it, right? So this isn't a conversation about this current administration versus previous administrations. Almost all administrations have looked this way, right? When they're signing laws about women's rights. So this in particular, I believe this was about an abortion law. And this is only like half the picture, but if you look around the room, if you look at like the session that was held to even consider this, it was 100% white, cis, straight males, right? And so really thinking of those things, right? And if you have things like that, right, then where is that autonomy that we're talking about? And then ultimately on really terrible scenarios, and yet also really common, right, of the bullying, the harassment, and the murder that happens, right? There's a reason that trans women of color have a life expectancy of 30 to 35, right? There's very drastic reasons. There are reasons why within even our communities in Connecticut, you could be living in a zip code and across the street, there could be a different zip code and the life expectancy could shift by like 10, 20 years just by crossing a street. Right, so really thinking of some of those things for your towns, for the cities that you're a part of, and also just for the state as a whole and the country. Right, where I am in the Bay Area right now, I'm in Berkeley, but literally next town over, like we'll have like 20 years less of life expectancy in different parts of Oakland, right? So less than a 5-minute drive, and yet 20 years difference in life. And then ultimately that's. Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, infant mortality amongst Black women is another one that is pretty scary.
Yeah,
on that.
Absolutely. There was actually just a study that just came out like a couple weeks ago, where it showed that the likelihood of a Black baby to survive was 3 times as high if it was a Black doctor caring for this baby, right? And so really thinking of those things and thinking of them outside of the realm of shame, right? So many of these conversations we can look at them and be like, oh my God, why didn't I know this? And I'm the problem and I did this and I did that. And it's really not about that, right? It's really about how do we all move forward, right? We're all here to build those spaces of belonging within our communities. And recognizing these things helps with those things. And then ultimately, we want to kind of get to this next page. So, Torrin, can you go to the next slide? So I wanted to bring this back from last week just to highlight a few different things, which we can talk about later if we have a little bit of time. But if you go to the next slide, and the next slide. All right, so really want to highlight the things that we can actually be doing within our communities. Right, and we just skipped the slide of like, how has this impacted individuals within the LGBTQ and TGNC communities? And as you can imagine, right, it's impacted drastically, right? If we're saying that ordinarily, outside of a pandemic, housing security, like mental health security, medical security, safety are all up in the air always, right? You can imagine what happens when a pandemic hits, right? So currently, like with the mutual aid work side of things, we receive requests probably every single day from a trans individual somewhere across the state for housing, right? Where either due to, even though like landlords are legally not allowed to evict you, but we've had a lot of people that have been like, well, I would rather be houseless than deal with harassment from my landlord, right? Because there are no options around that. The amount of people who have lost their jobs, right? The amount of people who have had to go to unsafe work spaces, right, during this pandemic, all of it is heavily impacted, and that goes across the state. One of the things I've learned a lot over the last few weeks is, or a few months with this pandemic, is just how many trans people, and specifically BIPOC trans people who are also a lot of times disabled, how many of them live within rural spaces and just towns across the state, because the vast majority of us imagine that most queer and trans people are going to be in urban cities. The reality is they're everywhere. So question becomes, what do we do about it, right? And so here are like 5 different things to kind of consider. And you'll have access to all these slides afterwards as well. And so just different things to kind of challenge your communities with, right? So the first one's prioritizing the creation of a world beyond capitalism. So when we're talking about things like the pink tax, right, when we're talking about a lot of different policies and things like that, a lot of them are rooted in capitalism. And so really within your groups, reimagining, well, what does your community look like outside of systems of oppression? Right? And you can focus on certain systems, you could focus just in general, right? But really thinking of like, so if we're talking about queer and trans folks, right? So what does your community look like if queer and trans folks felt safe everywhere, right? If the things that we talked about don't happen, if trans women of color live to 78, like their cis counterparts, right? If trans and queer kids felt safe in schools, right? If that 17% were not leaving schools, if that 40 to 70% were not attempting or dying from suicide, right? What do our communities look like then? And with that goes the centering marginalized voices, and specifically really committing to centering marginalized voices equitably, right? So recognizing that trans individuals and queer individuals will have a harder time finding economic opportunities, harder time with housing, harder time with like virtually everything, harder time with safety. What does that look like, right? So it might not look like all right, let's just add a seat at the table and bring in the first trans person that we can think of and have that conversation, right? A lot of times it requires back-end conversations of how do we make this table safe in the first place, right? How do we make sure that we're honoring that maybe this trans person has 3 jobs and now we're asking them to come and sit at this table for 6-hour meetings. That's going to make some of those other jobs more challenging, right? That's going to potentially put some of those things at risk.
And often not compensating them is another piece for that.
Exactly. And so really considering some of those things, right? Of how do you counteract those effects and do this equitably? Which goes into paying people for their lived experience, right? Honoring people, all of those things. Number 3, creating pathways for self-actualization that are accessible to the most marginalized. And that really requires even going to a basic conversation of what does self-actualization look like in our town, in our city, in our space, in our community. And it could be a community of like a community center, it could be a school, it could be any kind of community, or it could be the broader community. But what does it look like? And what needs to shift so that that's accessible to everybody? Number four, being accountable in how we've shown up and operated previously. We've all made mistakes. We've all shown up in ways that are not perfect, right? And so how do we have those conversations? How do we make amends with the communities that we've harmed along the way, both today and historically? Right? I've worked with a couple of towns where like 40 years ago, something happened, right? And to this day, certain communities are not talking to one another, right? We need healing from those things. We need to have those conversations. Number five, really funding marginalized folks directly. So going to Elizabeth's point, right, of really honoring that experience and compensating people for it, really looking at, how do we create opportunities where the most marginalized don't have to, constantly be at risk of being harassed in their employment and being let go and things like that, right? So, and really thinking of, and this is a question that's a little bit longer, and so really thinking of this over a longer period of time, but how much money from your organizations go to non-white, non-cis, non-straight, non-able-bodied people? And I really want, and I don't, I don't want you like communicating that answer or anything like that, but just really thinking about it. Right, I've worked with a lot of places where they're like, yes, Black Lives Matter, right? Trans people matter, disabled folks matter, all of those different things. And also at the same time, those communities have never paid a marginalized group or individuals for any resources, any support, anything at all. They've never staffed individuals who are marginalized. They've never hired them as consultants, all of those different things. And even on a personal level, I know I constantly think of how much of my personal money is going to marginalized communities. So even though I'm marginalized myself, but what does it mean when I say Black Lives Matter and I actually put my money with that, right? And what does that look like for each person? But really thinking of those things and how that by itself can make shifts, right, within spaces. I usually tell communities of, or organizations in particular, where they're like, we've had a lot of anti-Blackness, we don't understand Black Lives Matter. I'm like, okay, cool, hire a Black consultant. And they're like, okay, but we're not like ready for everything and all that kind of stuff. And like, we might not listen and everything. I'm like, cool, at least a Black person has now received some money from you. And that by itself has so much power. Right, that by itself starts shifting the culture of different spaces, because unfortunately within a capitalism, value equals money, right? If we're not paying for certain things, that means we don't value it, right? And so when you hire a Black trans disabled individual into your town to support you, into different conversations to support you, all of those different things, that by itself makes a huge statement. That by itself starts shifting the values that that the community is built off of. And so if we go to the final next slide, I know we're a little over time, but wanted to kind of remind everyone of this, from last time, right? If it's not for everyone, especially the most impacted, it's not justice. And justice isn't something that we can just have today, right? It's something that we build towards. It's something that we utilize the 5 things that we just discussed to really work our way and get there. It's something that, equity coaches, again, can support with. Each town has at least those 4 hours and more if needed. And so feel free to have these conversations with your equity coaches and really build beyond that. And one thing that I find that a lot of towns don't realize is that the equity coaches are not just there to support you with a single action or just the actions that are within the sustainable CT guidelines, but they can support you with any of these conversations. Right? Equity is so much more than just a checklist. And I've worked with some towns that truly honor that, and that's always beautiful. And also would love to see even more of it. So with that, I'll kind of end there. I don't know if anyone has any quick questions. Again, though, we are accessible after this. So feel free to reach out with any questions. Feel free to ask for an equity coach to kind of support your town a little bit more in depth. We're always happy to support whatever that looks like.
And we have another equity coach that's actually on the line, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but Renee, if you wanted to just wave to identify yourself as another equity coach. Yeah.
So any final questions? I know that was a lot. Um, so Susan asks, how do we access all the webinars in the series? Torn, do you want to take that one?
I'm about to put the link down below right now. I had a hard time managing the webinar and getting the links already, so I'm working on it.
Cool.
I think Janice had her hand.
Go ahead, Janice.
Yes, actually, that was my question was, we're really, really want to move forward with presenting these different classes to our community. We plan on doing a big kickoff at the end of the month. Will I be able to put this out for all of our people that live in town to take these courses and go through them and then, work it through? Can I do that? Is that okay?
Yeah, definitely. Feel free to share this link with whoever from the town or anybody you feel needs to hear some of this. And then
Okay.
again, also like afterwards, if as a follow-up, like you wanted to have a broader conversation with the community that's fully customized, right? Like,
Can I do that? Will you guys do that?
so feel free to reach out and you'll be paired with an equity coach and they would be able to kind of support with that as well. But definitely love that idea of having everyone in town or as many people as possible kind of listening into these conversations. That way you're all on the same page versus everyone starting from completely different levels in these conversations.
Okay, because our IT people for the town of South Windsor are working on the ability to be able to set this up, do a big kickoff, and then have people from anywhere you live in South Windsor to go ahead and sign on. And it would be nice to have an equity coach with us with that. Would somebody be able to do that if we were able to set that up?
So I would say reach out. So Torrin just added the link and then we can go from there.
Torrin, can I just right click that and then copy it to a town email?
You should be able to, yes.
Okay, I'm not really tech like that, but there's just so many people we want to reach and we just want to launch series after series after series. And if Sustainable CT can help us with that, that would be terrific. And I just wanted to add a real quick thing. We're finding here in town, after all of the different sessions that we've had with people and reaching out and listening, a lot of this stuff is happening in the schools. The education area is they just have so much work to do. We're finding that a lot of young middle school students and high school students are coming to us and to the Board of Education and experiencing, of course, everything that you talked about on a daily basis. And of course, we've got to start and we've got to knock this thing out. So this series would be great. But thank you, Ahmed, you did a great job. And Torrin, thank you for your IT support as well. Elizabeth, thank you for identifying and providing a lot of information and understanding, because we need to understand this, all of us. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. And it looks like Tiffany had a question as well. We'll do this as like the final question. Where can I find resources for supporting K-8 students from the LGBPQ and TGNC community? And Elizabeth kind of responded of, I would outreach Torrin, get paired with an equity coach who could support you in getting resources in this area. Absolutely. And Tiffany, I would also look at like, if you're thinking of local resources versus like more national based resources. I don't remember which town you're in the state, but there are also local organizations that we could kind of pair you up with that could kind of support with like more in-depth resources and things like that. So feel free to reach out and we're happy to have that conversation. All right, awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being here. You're all amazing. Apologies that we went over the time, but really appreciative of all of you and the work that you're all doing. And hopefully see some of you next week.
Thank you all. Great having you all here.
Bye, everyone.
Take care, everyone. Until next
Bye,
Friday.
everyone.